return to meaning. Social science with something to say. A couple of years ago, it was initiated by David Masson at Oxford University Press, and his sense of academia was that a lot of people were complaining about problems in having something socially significant to offer to people that are paying our wages and having some hopes and aspirations for our universities. And I think that we are in a situation where we can ask ourselves, are we at the end or near the end of scholarship? This is drastically formulated, but at least in our subjects, and I assume that most of us participating here, we are in management, organization studies, business, research, etc. It's not so obvious that the level of scholarship is really that satisfactory a lot of the time. Are we doing meaningful social research? I mean, some people probably say that research is meaningful. It's about finding the truth or developing insights or describing the world in such a way so that we understand it better and then can through concepts and through access to facts and so on, we can combat myths, and we can act in a much more clever, reflective way and solve our problems. Well, not necessarily. If you look at least some statements around how we are doing, then it's not so much the state of the state of the affairs, but the state of the misery that one can point at, perhaps. It's obvious that there are more and more research, number of people doing research, PhD students, faculty members, that's increasing all the time, and we get more and more publications, more and more journals. One would assume that with this enormous expansion over a few decades, then valuable knowledge really would increase. There should be many more interesting theories, many more studies, empirical studies that people find really insightful, interesting, worth reading and worth recommending to others. That always contribute less and less. We contribute less and less with all this. At the EGOS conference 2015, I gave a talk at the subplenary, about 400 people there. And then I thought, what are we all doing? What kind of presentations have I listened to here during this conference? And then I thought about Churchill, and Churchill, he said something a bit similar to this. Never before in the history of human knowledge development has so many had so little to say to so few. This was meant as an insult or provocation, but what happened then, the audience, they started to do like this. And I think it's a common experience. You're at the conference, you hear a lot of presentations, so you go through a number of journal issues, and then, so what? What's the point of all this? What are we actually doing, contributing with? And here, part of the problem is that with the massification of higher education, especially in business and management, then we create a lot of quantities, but there may be quality problems, not only in terms of the average contribution, but also in the total contributions that we do, so that it becomes rarer and rarer to see work that really makes a difference in terms of high quality or something original, I don't know what to say. And sometimes we have the impression that we are more and more into credentials, into ranking, into career optimization, not so much in doing good research that develops socially and academically valuable knowledge. So when we wrote the book, then Return to Meaning, we thought that these are important issues to discuss and hopefully to inspire some perhaps new ways of thinking about ourselves, our work, and our accomplishments. So one way of formulating the development, and this is something that to some extent can support in the book Return to Meaning. We try to strengthen our thesis as much as possible. But the idea here is not, of course, to produce a final, objective, detailed description about the state of affairs, but to point at issues and try to function as an eye opener for people involved in all this kind of work. And I think it is clear that to a high extent that research is very much about people demonstrating their employability or their promotability or the respectability of their own institutions. So the key word, the slogan, the guiding force here is getting published. You need journal publications. And that's fine. I mean, I confess that some of my best friends, they write journal articles, and I even do that myself, perhaps even too much. So we are all guilty on this journal publishing mania or fetishistic orientation to journal publication, but it's not unproblematic at all. And one problem is that research publications, particularly journals, they have gone from being a means to an end. Once upon a time, I think that most people saw it as a possible outlet, as a way of getting feedback, getting up quality, and then you optimize the journal article as a means to reach an audience. You could write a journal article, you could write a book chapter, a book chronicle, any kind of text. It doesn't matter that much as long as it's a good text and you'll find somehow an audience. That is probably not how most people think and feel about it today. It should be, it's the end. The end is to get published. And then it's good if some people read the piece or are influenced by it or expect. It is very much a matter of then getting published, and then you can put it on the CV, and then you can show to others and to yourself that you are kind of a diligent, intelligent, smart person, and that's then good for your career or for your institution. And this logic then means that we become less of scholars, less committed to knowledge development and doing research that is more open-minded and curious-driven and focused on having something important to say. And instead we become more of journal production technicians. So we cultivate ourselves to be very good at writing journal articles. One friend, she said when she'd been into this business for a couple of decades, she couldn't write anymore. Outside this type of sphere or genre that we are specialized in. When I did my PhD, and for a long time, people typically wrote a monograph and then perhaps wrote journal articles, but now it's more and more that people do kind of collection of papers, dissertations, and some of the stuff is co-written with supervisors or senior people, and the fine-tuning of articles becomes extremely important. And that calls for a journal-producing technician more than a kind of real scholar. Just imagine then the great intellectual heroes that we still may worship or at least have a lot of respect for. They will probably be finished by efforts to be published in an American A journal. Imagine if Foucault or whoever trying to do that. And there's a lot of complaining about journal publications. I mean, sometimes you encounter something that is well researched, there's an idea, there is a contribution, if you find the empirical study interesting and rich and so on. But on the whole, there's an enormous amount of complaints about journal publications. So people find them often formulaic. They should look more or less the same. One editor of a journal, a big American journal, said that journal articles now, they are like black cats in a coal cellar. We can't distinguish them from each other. So a more bureaucratic style seems to have taken over. Not much space then for individuality, originality, artistic skills, or whatever. Contributions tend to be very incremental. You build on earlier research, you just try to add something, and many people, they complain about footnote adding studies rather than something that really makes a clear difference. And a lot of research publications, they are very tribe-oriented. So you write for a particular, what we in the book, Return to Meaning, call micro-tribes. And that is people that share your own petty interests. And in order to get published, you need to satisfy experts in your particular micro-tribe. So they are very important for your career. In order to get published, then you write the stuff in such a way so that they will be satisfied with this. Which means that most other people will be dissatisfied with this because they may have other broader frameworks or expectations or mindsets or whatever. And all this leads to quote one of my co-authors, Andres Spicer, co-author of the Stupidity Paradox. I'm shamelessly promoting my own books every time I give a talk. He said that contemporary academia is like a hothouse of functional stupidity. A lot of people that are quite narrow-minded, specialized, think in terms of journal publications, etc., etc. And these are people that are successful within our systems. And the success recipe for individual researchers and also for departments and schools tend to lead to research that is relatively meaningless or irrelevant in the broader context. And I have summarized all this from research to research. Do you know what research is? That means return on investment search. Return on investment search. And this struck me when I participated in a seminar, and one person there, young, ambitious academic, he talked about the success recipe. And then always used the expression return on investments. So you go to a conference and then you participate as a, I don't know, doing workshops, or you are editorial board member or whatever, and then return on investment was very crucial. And your entire research is very much based on this as well. So you are specialized, you read the literature, you know the players, you can navigate in a particular field, and then you made all this investment. So you have a cultural and social capital in a particular subfield or micro-tribe. And then based on that, you can exploit all this and get a large number of good publications into the right jobs, etc. And he thought that this was smart and clever, and people sitting there, they were using the same vocabulary. And then I just thought, I've done during my career the total opposite, I think. And because I like to do different things, I think I should be open-minded and not necessarily go for American A-level journals or other things like that. And I've never been to Academy of Management meetings either. So, but that's perhaps not so good career recipe for people to follow these days. But from research to research when you are searching for something, researching. try to be curious and open and see what goes on here, then you move more and more into research. Return on your investments. Use your skills. Develop a particular brand or profile and be known there and then stand out in a particular way as part of this research logic. So, and we feel that all this means that meaning is being lost or reduced. There's one excellent article by Burkhard Sievers in Organization Studies 1986 called From Meaning to Motivation. From meaning to motivation. And very good article. And it means that when you lose a sense of meaning, then you get motivation instead. And we have a lot of motivation in contemporary academia with performance management, the metrics. We have a lot of promotions, rewards, and so on, which is a bit different than from in the past when people got their lectureships and then they were not expecting much promotion, so they concentrated on intrinsic rewards instead, meaningful of doing stuff. And it was quite common that people doing teaching, and then every third year they had sabbatical, and then if they had something to say, they spent the time writing a book. And typically much more interesting than now people all the time focusing on pumping out the journal articles. So meaning. What do we mean by meaning? And it's me and co-authors, Janis Gabriel and Roland Paulsen. Well, meaning calls for something being comprehensible. It needs to be understood. It should be seen by somebody, an audience for which it's meaningful, then to be relevant. It addresses some concerns, some issues that are not too narrow when it comes to research. It should be valid, so it should be empirical support and be credible and kind of make sense from that perspective. And it should have an intellectual contribution. So it should not be like consultancy or just solving any practical problem for good advice or illuminating what a particular company may be interested in. It should have some intellectual contribution. And if you are able to score on all four, then meaning is a relevant concept to use, we would say. But the question is always meaning for who? And of course, in what way? And there are different spheres of interest or spheres of meaning, meaningfulness. Here, and of course, most research tend to be have some meaning or some meaningfulness for the researcher, him or herself. The ego should find this a good project, etc. But not necessarily. I guess there's a lot of people that are doing research just for instrumental purposes, for raising their status. I like to have a PhD. I'm engaging in a PhD program because I want to be a PhD, so my mother-in-law will be not too unhappy with me or whatever reason. Or I'm teaching at this university and I need to have a PhD in order to make it look good. I'm not so interested, but I need to do this. Or you may have started as an interested and committed PhD student or a researcher, but after some time you run out of fuel. It doesn't work particularly well. People don't appreciate the work. And then I only want to get rid of this. I only want to finish. And then, of course, meaning is not necessarily a key element of the elements of this process. So meaning and meaningfulness is not there. So a lot of research is probably driven by totally other things than meaning, even for the ego, for the individual, for the research. But hopefully then what you are doing has some meaning for you. Then we have another interest group or category here, Sver, that's the micro tribe, people that are like you or me, other nerds, fanatically interested in new business models or the details of service encounters in the restaurant industry or whatever people can be fascinated by. They may be or wanting to use Lacan's ideas on strategic decision making or something like that. So there may be a micro tribe of other esoteric people interested, or it may be a large group as well. But this has some academic interest. And this is fine because you may contribute to intellectual discussions and some qualification of this group. But then you have the third category here, and that's the public. The public. The public then can be people in a particular industry, in a particular occupation or profession, or it could be the general educated public that are interested in work conditions, in gender discrimination, ethnic issues, HR, whatever. And meaningful research then, hopefully, I mean, in the best of the worlds, we should be able to satisfy the thirst first for meaningfulness in all these three groups or in all these three spheres. I think that on the whole, academic research tend to have very little to say to the educated public or to businesses. So if you read an academic journal and then you think about intellectual friend like a person that's the head of a hospital clinic or headmaster or CEO of whatever firm, can you in this special issue find anything of interest for that person? Probably not. I mean, you may look at an entire volume, 50 articles, and then you may be lucky to say that now I find something that my intellectual friend here working in the industry or public sector may be really interested in or benefit from reading and learning from them. So, and also when it comes to the group or the micro tribe, the question is it becomes smaller and smaller, and maybe something wrong with me. Perhaps I should raise this with my team. But when I look at all these journal issues that I'm sent to as an editorial board member, then not that fascinating or inspiring. And when I read it, I have difficulties to remember, okay, what's the key point here? What's novel? What's clearly worth remembering or even quoting? We had a noise. Somebody was having a heart attack on my speech here, so I probably need to calm down a bit. There are 33 on the chat here, but we skipped that for the moment. Let me continue. And why do we do research? I mean, of course, if we are into COVID-19, that's obvious. If we're into some areas of medicine, engineering perhaps, and so on, it's quite obvious. Although even in these fields, a lot of stuff that people do is probably not particularly valuable. People in Sweden, at least, they get a PhD in medicine because that's good for their career, not because that improves them as physicians. In some cases, it probably makes them worse as practicing physicians because a lot of time and energy and focus and so on moves into the academic stuff rather than to make them into better practitioners. So, but why do we do all this research? We could say that people have done research now for 100 years, and we have, in the field of psychotherapy, I think that every 5th year in psychotherapy research, there are about, I think, 40,000 papers published. And in organization studies, we probably have much more than that. I mean, not in top-level journals, but if we look at everything that is seen as or defined as research and appears somewhere, we have more than 10,000 of publications or papers every year, and I can say that that's probably enough. It's more than enough. It's saturation. It's post-saturation. So we could stop doing that and try to look at what we have done and then learn something from there instead of pumping out more papers. But we need to do this research because this is university, and what is distinct about university or business school? Well, there is research. What would we do? What would happen with our institution, our status, and general constructions of who we are and what we stand for, and so on, without the research? Well, it will start to crumble. So we do research because we need to reproduce the institution of universities and business schools, and we do that through a number of people then doing research, or actually may do research instead, but it's seen as research, and research is good. It has this kind of connotation of science, quality, contribution, and blah, blah, blah. So we need to do this. And then there are different kind of orientations here, and I will not explain this for time reasons. You can take a look at the book if you are very curious about this. But there are different lurking motives. So we have more instrumentalist motives, and then you have more narcissistic motives. It should say narcissism down here, narcissism. So that's one dimension if you are more into instrumentalism, just want to effect, or narcissism, this is me, it's important for me, I need to do this, I like to do this. And then you have religious orientations, and then here you have something else that is more cynical. And then one can plot different motives, and this is actually empirically derived from various confessions of bitter academics and so on. But then you may not be in this field at all. You may be the opposite. You may be very socially committed. You may be very other-oriented. You may have a rather non-religious attitude to things, and you may not be cynical at all. So if that is the case, then you put yourself into this picture diagram here, but you probably can pinpoint your enemies, people that you dislike, perhaps your supervisors or some of the colleagues of your department that are not as good as you are in terms of motives and orientations to the doings of research. Purpose lost. I may sound very cynical and bitter and disappointed here. Yes, that's true. I'm that a bit, actually. I'm disappointed, for I think that we could do much better. But I'm not the only person that share this sentiment. Here's a statement from J.C. Spender. In general, I see very few people doing work they think important for anything but the tenure and promotion treadmill. It seems less a matter of personal professional choice than the way our professionalization projects clamp down on our sense of purpose. And in the book, in other papers, we have a large number of specific examples of this. I will never forget one episode when I was flying from one conference to another. I don't go to that many conferences, but this happened once. And then I met a colleague I know quite well. I asked him, "Dear X, what are you working on now?" And then the response was, quote, "I'm revising papers for X, Y, and Z and W journals. I already my 4x4 publications, but my dean gives me more rewards if I publish extra articles in these type of journals." And then after clarified the logic, he then continued by saying something about the content of what he was working with. But apparently then revising papers for the journals, and then the reward system came to his mind first and second, and then only a bit later, then this was about the content of what he was working with. And career workshop, this is probably not pedagogical to show you text excerpts, but still, if you're interested, you can spend a couple of minutes reading this while I'm resting my voice. This is from a career workshop where a leading scholar explains to PhD students and younger faculty how the world operates. Yes, and then you can, if you are a taxpayer or looking from this from the outside, I mean, why should we fund this type of activity? And this is how often young people are socialized into our profession, our field. It's very much about citations, the right metrics, perform better than others. A bit sad, perhaps, or thrilling if you like to do that, if you have a more cynical attitude to things. When it comes to the social sciences, I think we need to recognize that the basis for our legitimacy, the reason for us being, I mean, once upon a time, there were no social science. It's a relatively new idea. And it's expanded enormously. It's very much because kids, they want to go to school and they want to study something, and then not everybody can be engineers or working in healthcare. So then you have social science and you have management and business. That's a kind of mushroom. Obvious one that we qualify ourselves as teachers, which is important. And the research has some purpose. You get a PhD because then you become qualified to some extent, at least as an academic teacher. You show that you are diligent enough and you have some perhaps brain powers, even though I doubt that it's needed anymore all the time. And you read literature and you keep track of things and so on. So that's good. But apart from this, apart from PhD and research as a supplement or a substitute and for huge course works, then the idea of social research and also management and organizational research is that we should contribute with knowledge, with text that some people, they read and then they learn from that. So the outlet here is not just that you have found a particular ingredient in the COVID-19 virus or contribute marginally to the development of vaccine. The people don't have to read it. It's perhaps enough if a few other experts read it and they build on that knowledge. But in social science, I mean, you can't just assume that now I have a recipe or a blueprint or the solution, and then that's communicated to a top management person or a government, and then based on that, they will kind of fix everything through fantastic decision making. No, for us to have some type of positive effect, we need to be read. There needs to be readers. That's the way to have an impact. And then we need to produce texts that have a clear message, that has aesthetic qualities, textual qualities, and based on an idea and some interesting and valuable type of material being included. And we need to be read by other academics, by practitioners, and or the educated public. And of course, it's difficult to be read by everybody, but the ambition must be to reach outside only the academic microtribe. The profession can be like marketeers or branding people or consultants, the educated public being interested in consumption issues or work-life issues or whatever. They should be reached. Of course, some people believe that you need to write another management pornography text, but that's not necessarily the point here. You can write a respectable academic text, stripped of jargon and rich in terms of content and interesting as a message, and reach a large audience. It's not necessarily a bestseller, but it still can find a large audience. I think that when David Riesman published The Lonely Crowd, 1950, a sociological study, thick one, I think that it ended up as on the front page of Newsweek or Times or something like that. So occasionally then you can reach a large audience, and we have academics that are successful in this. And even if you don't necessarily aim for very large number of readers, still it should be possible to reach either a broad group of practitioners or parts of the educated public. But when we write text and produce research, how do we typically write? Well, it's a lot of jargon. And sometimes I have a feeling that is what we are good at doing. Producing abstract, formulaic, very defensive, hard to penetrate texts that people only read because they need to scan them to have something to cite. I think that Dennis has done an excellent job, Dennis Turish, excellent job here in exploring and pointing at this in his book on the crisis of management research, and also his paper in Academy of Management, Learning and Education. In our book, we have this which is not the worst of all the major journals, but still, despite criticism of Bora Boys analysis, blah, 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 and then a lot of text being cited here. So we have this long original text, and then it actually means this. And this is the text by Roland Paulsen, who's an excellent author, which is large. He wrote one book. People said that this looks like something in between a scientific report and a black comedy. And it's on the pocket, and it's very good research, but also something people like to read because it's thought through and excellent empirical material. And Roland then he kind of summarized what he was forced to write by the reviewers of human relations. So they wanted more references, more abstract, more scientific writing. And it didn't start like this, but this is how it ended, and it all get published. And this is actually what it means. And this is a key element of our habitus, our speciality, that we write rather terrible text. I mean, not everybody's doing that, but often when you look through the journals, I mean, what are they really saying apart from a lot of abstract and hard to penetrate formulations? So what to do? Enough of complaining. Moaning and groaning has its time. Now we are over to the tricks part. What should we do then? And the standard thing is then to complain about journals and expect journals to improve, and you complain about everybody else. So always a lot of complaints about editors and reviewers when you talk about these things. But then the problem is that those that are complaining about this are also reviewers and sometimes editors. So it's very easy that if you are in the same room as some other people, that you all agree that we are doing good kind of creative work and we really like to say something important and blah, 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 blah. But the others, they are preventing us from doing this. People that are not in this room, they are preventing this, which is of course nonsense, because people in the room, they are the journal reviewers, etc. If you think about an academic conference. So I think we should stop complaining and then think, what can we do? What can I do? And you can do quite a lot. So one needs to do research with an idea. I think that this is actually should you do research? I mean, you can do a PhD, but after a PhD, should you do more research? Then you can do it for entirely instrumental reason. I need to have a job, and therefore I need to have 2 publications, blah, blah, blah. That can be acceptable, perhaps. But normally, in order to try to get something published, there should be an idea, some original idea, not just a repetition of what hundreds of people have said beforehand, more or less. It should be rich empirical material. Not only this, I've been out there, I've interviewed 25 people, 1 hour per interview, and then I collect this data, I sort it, codify it, and so on, and here I report it. It's not particularly rich in most cases. In the worst case, studies are only people are studying managers' interview behavior, which tends to be a bit polished, and a lot of impression management, a lot of social scripts then in circulation that I'm an authentic leader or whatever. And it should also be well written. Has some qualities, and stripped of too much jargon, and then this kind of smoke screening. I have nothing to say, but I say it in such a way so that it appears very impressive for people that don't use the judgment fully. We need to have less of formulaic research and an idea, rich data, and being well written. Of course, that's very difficult to accomplish. And our institutions are not necessarily supporting this. I think we need to work at least on 4 levels. It's easy if you are young and innocent and so on, as I am, for example. You work with yourself and people around you and perhaps your own organization, but you can do things in different ways in order to improve the situation. Most obvious is to work with identity implications. Who am I? Why am I doing this? What really drives me? What am I accomplishing? Research is very much an identity project. And then apart from, am I an institutional theorist? Am I that kind of version of institutional theory and so on, that you may struggle quite a lot with. If you're into institutional theory, that's overwhelming struggle, as it's so kind of messy and what is not institutional theory. So that can be complicated in itself, but I would say that these issues, am I a scholar? Am I interested in knowledge? Do I really try to read stuff, to think about issues, to develop something that is new, eager to make the effort to move out of my comfort zone and doing ethnographic study or doing re-interviews or finding people there in the bar when they're off guard, and then you do interviews. And perhaps can struggle a bit with ethics clearance committees and other people preventing interesting work from being done. And are you working a lot with the text, trying to be inspired to have a text that is like nicely written and so on? I mean, these are very much things that we do struggle with. And if we can become a bit more clear and ambitious around all this, I think it's a clear plus in the project. It has costs. It takes more time, it's more kind of anxieties, other problems, but still at the end of the day, I think that people will find, yes, I've done this. It took me an extra year. I had to starve or lower my consumption level. I had some conflicts and struggles and so on, but this is really a good study. I'm proud of this. It has something to say. I can manage the elevator pitch problem, not spending 45 seconds trying to explain what I'm doing and feeling really kind of embarrassed and sweat dripping down because there's no answer. What are you working on? What's your finding or contribution and so on? So there are social and interaction implications. So when you talk about what you and others are doing, one could ask questions such as, is this research worth a nurse or a teacher less? So if you have 50% research time as part of your associate professorship or something like that, is what you are doing worth a nurse or a teacher less out there? Because it's an alternative cost. And the more we ask for research time, then somebody else has to pay for this. And there are bus drivers, porters, physicians, police people, and so on that actually pay for research, and it should not just be for our ego trips. One could initiate a seminar culture of so what? You can ask the question in a friendly way. People may be insulted and so on, but I do think that so what? What's the point? What does this lead to? Who is benefiting from this? And in some cases, I think we need to accept that it's only the research, the PhD student, not all research necessarily need to be very much kind of altruistic or eager to say something, to save mankind, humankind. But should not be too idiosyncratic either, perhaps. So what question, not only what's your sample, have you referred to the right literature, how can you support your conclusion and so on, but a natural question to ask could be, so what, perhaps. And this is something that one can work with in one's cultures, institutional cultures, department settings, etc. One could work with organizational implications. You could see, how are we putting our money here in order to support research? Well, perhaps fewer conventional mentoring kind of activities, fewer journal publication workshops, less money to support journal writing and so on, but more idea generation, writing workshops. And I'm not thinking about academic journal publishing writing, but writing a good text done from ambitious journalists, for example. In between and fictional writing. You could do much more and demand this from your own department or school. We need to have activities helping us with this, but also signaling that this is bloody important. And then refrain from the stuff that we normally do, perhaps, in order to support people's career and having career workshops and career planning and a lot of other things, which tends to reinforce research rather than research. Well, if people are supposed to be promoted or employed, it's fine to have some journal publications. You probably can't avoid that. But are there any signs on a person spending 10 years in academia reaching a broader audience than the micro tribe with a quality message? I can say that this is in order to become an associate professor or full professor at least, then there should be clearly something outside just a mass of journal publications. I could have that as reasonable criteria. Write a book. I mean, in some subject areas, that's not the convention. The convention should perhaps be changed, but still. And on the last level, that's more on the national level, university level, perhaps, we could have institutions assessed on real contributions. What is a particular school or department really contributing with, say, over 5 years and so on? What have you done here? Well, we have 120 articles in and so on bloody journals. No, single out like 5 or 10 key contributions that really makes a difference, not on an individual level, but what's done by the collective. That could be policy reports, chronicles, somebody writing for New York Times chronicle, perhaps, that is seen as, wow, what an insightful text. Or it could be a book manuscript or published journal articles. That's fine as well, but it should be something that is qualitatively assessed by a panel of people, academics, and perhaps general intellectuals or something. And then one could assess institutions based on that rather than this, whatever system is being used. And one could make suggestions or struggles for this internally within the organization or externally, perhaps to politicians. I'm just going on here because I will finish this soon and then I open up for comments and so on. There are 40 statements here in the chat function. And it's a bit difficult to, if I should read all this, then I should forget what I'm saying here. So just a proposal here, if one is interested in doing interesting research, then you should read Murray Davis' article in Philosophy of Social Science, published in 1971. Where Davis, he wrote about interesting research. And it's a very simple road to this. Then you become familiar what the audience, the academic and the perhaps intellectual audience in the public assumes to be true about the subject, and then you generate a position which, in denying their assumptions, will attract their attention. So this is what we normally assume of the world. We carefully examine all these assumptions. Some of these assumptions may be wrong. And then you suggest a counter assumption. And then people will say, wow, that's interesting. Graham Ashley and Administrative Science Quarterly, 1985, he followed this up and said that there are two kinds of researchers. There are mediocre scientists that are unable to see beyond the established paradigms because of their failure to grasp and articulate their colleagues' or the audience ground assumptions. Successful scientists, on the other hand, are intuitively perverse, always ready to question except for opportunities, critical rejection of what is given by others. And now you realize that you have an identity struggle in front of you. What kind of researcher are you? Are you mediocre or are you perverse? It's easy to say, I'm creative and innovative and open and blah, blah, blah. Well, people may see you as quite perverse then because you are questioning the normal. I think this is like a Foucauldian argument here that interesting researchers are not normalized. And most of us tend to be normalized. And a lot of people say that, well, I'm doing PhD, then later on I will do interesting, innovative, socially relevant work. The problem is by then it's too late because you have become normalized. And then you tend to think as others and imitate this. We have actually developed a methodology for doing interesting research. And the idea is that if you have something interesting to say, then people will like to read it, and then you will having some impact on people's thinking, on their worldviews, on how they relate to reality. But you need to have something interesting to say in research. And it's very easy to identify dominant assumptions. You articulate these assumptions, and then you question them and find that some of these assumptions are problematic. and then you develop new assumptions about the subject matter. You consider the assumptions in relationship to the audience, and then if you find this will lead to the good effect, of course you need to be credible, but still, if you can do this in a convincing way, then the audience will hopefully respond with, that's interesting. Most research tends to be met by the response, that's obvious. If you overdo this, or you are not kind of qualified enough in your argumentation, because this is difficult to do this. It's not just like brainstorming and coming up with any wild idea. You need to show why a particular assumption is problematic. But that's like a gold mine, because all research areas, they are full of problematic assumptions that people take for granted. They are normalized. They are not perverse enough, or we are not perverse enough when we try to address these things. But if you do it in a bad way, or if you overdo this, then the response may be, that's absurd, it's not credible, I don't understand this, it's too much. But if you're interested in this methodology, you can look at Alvesson Sandberg Construction Research Questions, or our article in Academy of Management Review 2011. So I will finish now and open up for comments and questions. And if there are some people from Germany, you can express your Weltschmerz. Weltschmerz, that's a very good German word. That means that you express then the pain of the world, the miseries falling on your meager shoulders. Weltschmerz. Excellent word. All right, conclusion. We live in a time where we probably we're past affluence. We live in post-affluent society. There's too much technology, too much consumption, too much innovation, too many media, etc. We have too much research. I think that's the problem, that too many want to be researchers. That's understandable on an individual level, but if you look at this from a whole, I think that tends to draw quality down. Because with mass research, we need to be specialized. And in social science, we get a lot of quite specialized, tribe-focused, instrumentalized orientations and practices. Where getting published become very important. I mean, in the past, then there were not so many people around, but now you have a position and there are 150 apps. They are all specialized and who has time and interest to read what they are doing. So you look at the CV and our article publication and several good metrics and blah, blah, blah. You have a lot of instrumentalization and specialization as a part of all this. And that tends to make people not going for innovation or risky projects. You become normalized, mainstreamed, boring. We have too many authors and too few readers. The problem of the theater world. A lot of people would like to be on stage. Not that many people are eager to form an audience. And we have the same here. Many authors writing a lot of papers that nobody reads. And in social science, you need to have readers to make it meaningful. Unless research is only for your own qualification project or something like that. There is a shortage of new ideas. And here I think that massification is part of the problem. New ideas, it calls for people having some overview, doing different things, getting inspiration from different areas, trying something new, having open projects, doing more ambitious ethnographic studies where you can ask questions. Like I try to ask when we are doing research. Question A, what goes on here? Question B, what do the natives, the consultants, managers, salespeople, etc., think they are up to? And the third question is, what in hell do they think they're up to? And if you work a bit more like that, then sometimes sooner or later ideas pop up. I'm a bit inspired by a Swedish sociologist called Asplund, and he has had the idea that good social science, there are two elements. Element one, you construct or you stumble on a mystery. Step two, you solve the mystery. So good social research is like a detective story. You have these two ingredients, construction or bumping on a mystery, and then you solve it. We actually have a book, Mystery as Method, that explains this methodology in some length. There's an article in Academy of Management Review 2007 that is also explaining this approach by me and Dan Kerriman. But this kind of research, this methodologies to develop new ideas, they are seen as a bit risky and demanding, so people sometimes go for the easiest way to get published. And then it means that we have very few new ideas. I mean, petty ideas, but not really ideas that take off, that makes a difference. It's very easy to say that we need to be much more creative and imaginative. Disciplined imagination is one good slogan by Carl Weick. But we can do much more in order to facilitate this through our empirical work, through demanding something from our institutions, through having kind of accountability systems where what stands out as the true contribution is then being rewarded, or at least get attention, rather than all this matrix stuff. And one element that I mentioned before as one way that we can work with is to identify audience assumptions, and then if we can challenge these, then we are more interesting. And if we are more interesting, then people may be more inclined to read our stuff and listen to what we are saying. That goes for anybody from students to practitioners to the educated public and our own colleagues. And hopefully we can do better in these respects. So this is another audience, Egos 2015, when I said that never before in human history have so many had so little to say to so few. And the audience, they looked quite happy there. So, and if you are on this picture, then you probably have experienced this talk as a bit of a repetition, but repetition is sometimes very valuable. Yes. So I end my story. You find it talk a bit gloomy and depressing. I felt that the Weltschmerz was increasing. Then you probably feel a bit better if you look at these happy people here. This is Army Spicer, my co-author on the Stupidity Paradox. There are some other local celebrities here as well. Anyway, so Ibrat, we like to take control over the situation.
Thank you, Mats. This is very helpful. For those of you who joined us just before we started, I was saying that I would encourage, if you have any questions, please unmute yourself and ask Mats directly. That makes, I think, more personal, both for Mats and yourself. However, if you can't unmute yourself, please type up your question in the chat function and I can read it out to Mats to discuss. If you don't mind, I'll perhaps start with the first question. And then if you have any questions, by the way, you can raise your hand in the participants list or somewhere else. Mats, so thank you for this insightful talk. I suppose, considering that we still have so many people on the call, it suggests that your talk resonates with everyone. I suppose one of the questions I would like to ask is, you articulated what kind of research could become meaningful. But would you be able to give us perhaps some examples of scholars who would fall into that category that perhaps could serve us as inspiration? If anyone from top of your head.
Yeah, I mean, we all and I have my intellectual heroes. I was inspired by the Frankfurt School at one point of time. I think that some work by Richard Sennett is very good. It's a book by Frank Furedi, The Culture of Fear, that I find was really helpful for my thinking. When it comes to our own field here, I sometimes suggest David Corpason's piece on productive resistance in organization science 2012 as a very good example. It's like well researched, it has an important message, it's helpful for academics, for practitioners. So that I think is an example of a good study. David Corpason, Organization Science 2012. And then I could refer to some of my own work, but I'm so modest, so I will not do that.
Fair enough. Thank you, Matt. So let's take some questions from the audience. I saw Morteza raise his hand a little while ago. Morteza, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I would like to ask a question. Do you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. If I understood you well, you said that the goal of a study should be serving society or the public. But there is a problem. The problem is that serving public as a whole is a misguided concept. Why? Because we have limited resources in the society. So no matter what you do, you are depriving some people from their resources and giving these resources to some other class or group. And then the problem would be that no one would accept your concept of value, your construct of value, and we cannot come up with a general, universal concept of value that can guide us for our research. So, with serving society as being a meaningless concept, then I'm left with my moral values to act on that, or my petty interests. So isn't it a much better idea to go back to the wisdom of people like Adam Smith, who are like telling that when people are following their interests, their moral values, then at large, it would lead to the prosperity of society?
And I think it's a good question, and I'm not suggesting that all research should kind of serve the entire society. I just want to emphasize that we need to have some readers outside our microtribe, and that some people, it can be professionals, it could be a particular company, part of the educated public, that they should be interested in this, finding it meaningful and relevant. And then, of course, exactly what is the outcome of this in terms of the final benefits or the final harm, the distribution of resources and benefits and so on between different groups. It's always difficult to say, but we need to do something to reach outside our own microtribes and having something important and valuable to say to groups. And I think that it's fully possible. At the same time as we, of course, as you're implying, then need to consider then the politics and the complications of all this. But I'm very happy if I write something and I get mails from some people from the public that have read something and said that this was important, meaningful for me. I now can understand these things a bit better way, etc. Then I think I've done something. If I'm only reaching my fellow academics, or even not reaching them, even if it's a good journal publication, I think that I have failed at least. But not everybody needs to imitate me here or be on the same kind of track as I am. But I do think that as a collective, we should be sure that we have something to say to also other groups outside our own.
Yeah, but the result would be the same. I mean, it doesn't change that much because you use some terms that are really loose terms, like valuable research. What is a valuable research? From whose perspective? And that is the roots of the problem. If you do not solve it, if you cannot come up with a construct which is acceptable by everyone as value for society, then we cannot argue like that. And then we end up with the same result that we are here right now, in the sense that every person.
I mean, of course, we need to have critical discussions regarding exactly in specific cases what is a valuable knowledge contribution. But at one step here, apart from all the methodological issues and problems when it comes to assessing quality of research, is that you say something, you write something in such a way so that it can be understood and be considered by a group. And then I do think that is an important step that we should take. Then I guess that one criteria is that people have read, they have understood it, they find this is meaningful and relevant, they can solve some of the problems, or at least sharpen their thinking, they can stress their mind, making them feel more reflective about things. And then I think that you're doing something quite positive. So the ambition is, of course, not to necessarily increase the net value of everything for everybody in society, but to do something that the core audience that you are targeting can be HR managers or people interested in how hospitals are functioning, that they get something out of your study. And you need to demonstrate this, and hopefully then all the assessments makes it credible that this has some value for some people somewhere.
Okay, thank you. Sophie, would you like to go next?
Thank you. Thanks, Nat. So I sense that there's a lot of energy here for doing interesting research, and we have a lot of early career scholars who have a lot of energy for pursuing this kind of work and this sort of alternate paradigm. But my sense, and what I'm sort of struggling with personally, and I'm sure others are too, is locating a research community with whom to get, right? Mentorship, advice, friendly reviews, perhaps support with the review process. And my guess is that it doesn't have to be within your discipline. In fact, finding and locating interesting work kind of opens you up to maybe talking to scholars more broadly. But what's unclear to me is, how do we go about finding these people? And do you have any suggestions for locating people who are receptive to and interested in mentoring early career scholars that are looking to do this kind of work?
You have the normal channels, PhD courses, you read stuff that you find inspiring, and perhaps an extra effort to connect and bond with people that you find inspirational as authors. It can be sometimes tricky if these people are very senior, because they tend to be quite occupied and they have large networks already, but you may be able to locate junior people that you feel that here is some kind of affiliation, and then make an extra effort to connect to these folks. At conferences, you can speak up a bit, not just being eager then to say the right things here in order to adapt to the situation and then get by without too much problems, but you can try to say something that is a bit outside the conventional and point at these more basic issues around who are we, what do we do, what do we accomplish, and so on. I do think that as the response here at the EGOS conference, I was rather nervous before, when I said this. Never before in human history have so many has so little to say to so few. I will get a lot of enemies, but people found that relieving, and then you may create some contacts here that are valuable. And research is lonely work, and in many cases you are at the department that people are not particularly sympathetic to, non-mainstream the orientations, and then it's very important then to have networks and maintain these, have collaborations, and make sure that you make this, go this extra mile in order to develop and maintain them. So that's a very important aspect around all this. And if one is good at collaborating, it's easier to do rich studies. You can get more ideas, perhaps. You can pool empirical materials. I mean, in most cases, I find empirical studies very thin, not much interesting out there interviewing a number of people, and then you just kind of sort it and codify the material. But it's enormous shortage of really good stuff. And then if you can collaborate in clever ways, then I think we could do much better. But it calls for some extra effort. And then we read stuff and we polish our papers and this and other, revise and resubmit, and that's most important, etc. And then the social support functions that we could mobilize, they are not there. I also mentioned that one could demand or suggest at the department or school level, couldn't we have more like activities like creative writing workshops, etc. Could have that across the university, and then people with similar orientations, they may gather there, and then you have the basis then for better network.
Thank you, Sophie. Ravi, would you like to go next?
Sure, thanks. My question is, can we have a field where everyone's doing interesting research? It seems to me that there's probably some level of complementarity between incremental and interesting research, where if there isn't enough incremental work, what is this assumptions that this problematizing research or this interesting research is going to question? So it would seem that maybe there needs to be some, we could agree that there maybe needs to be more interesting research, but maybe fields couldn't exist without a majority of incremental research. Because I mean, I imagine that if there's maybe two ways that it could go. If everyone's trying to be interesting, everyone's just endlessly deconstructing each other's assumptions, and you really do get nowhere. It's kind of the mess of just constant deconstruction of deconstruction of deconstruction. The other way would be that maybe there is some sort of ground truth, and we are, problematizing claims, but then that moves knowledge forward in a pragmatic sort of way. And then what we end up with is an agreement on assumptions that is pretty robust and that will lead to incremental research. So I'm kind of curious, obviously we agree that there needs to be more interesting research, but is it really an end in itself? What's the optimal mix? And is it the case, kind of to some degree, as Jeff Pfeffer argued a long time back, that we'll inevitably end up with paradigms and we'll end up with consensus and incremental research as our fields progress and become better developed?
Yeah, I think it's a good point, and we can't all be interesting because it's a relative concept. Interesting is what stands out in relationship to what's normalized or conventional. So in that sense, only a minority can do that. But I think most of us can become a bit more interesting, at least for certain groups, audiences. And my problem is that there's enormous shortage of really interesting stuff. So I'm not necessarily saying that everybody should be doing this all the time, but perhaps to a higher degree and more frequently. So I agree with you, but I don't think that in the near future we have research. I think we've had that kind of situation.
I think that makes sense. We're in a relative drought, so maybe it doesn't make sense to talk about the flood.
Yep.
Thank you, Ravi. Anastasia, would you like to go next?
Thank you very much for organizing this event and for this talk. My name is Anastasia. I'm from Erasmus University. And my question was inspired, by your talk. I found a lot of similarities to a pragmatist approach, to American pragmatism, when you talked about practical impact, the difference which research makes to the world, and problematization. And American pragmatists were very, very clear about not dividing science from making world a better place, from philosophy, from art, etc. Right, and the values which they considered foundational were very clear. It were democratic ideals, like Mary Parker Follett's work is very illustrative of it in management. But I was thinking always how to personally, when you write a paper and try to reconcile that, that's not obvious how you do that, how you reconcile how you keep together facts and values, and is it even possible to pursue these pragmatist ideals in scientific field in general, or as we see in the world in general, there is so much divide and there are other people, like in a Weberian sense, being in totally different value sphere, and we will always talk past each other whatever we do. So I was thinking maybe you can express your opinion on how this value-based research can play out in a larger scale in the whole field of academia.
Well, I don't know if I have any particular good answer to this. I do think that the Davis approach, where you learn about the assumptions of your audience, and then carefully consider what is a good way to represent the ideas, the assumptions, the frameworks that people tend to take for granted. And then if you work through that, then you can come up with an alternative assumption and really show that this is an assumption. It may not be entirely wrong, but it may be a bit partial. It may be part of what's taken for granted, and we can at least accomplish some mind stretch or some dialectics in the thinking here between one thesis and another. For example, leaders lead followers. Yes, perhaps followers lead leaders through feedback, manipulation, from being more people, from being inclined to be deaf to the messages or resistance or whatever. Then you have like a counter assumption, and then people may have different views on all this, but then at the end of the day, it may be a point in thinking through both these basic perspectives, or a third one, that leadership is only like a play. People pretend to do this, and it's not necessarily something that sticks, that drives the world around in a particular way. But you have another of assumptions and counter assumptions, and if you present that, I assume that most people could say, okay, here enough people will at least get some inspiration for think through this in a slightly different way, and there may be some potential insights, even if you don't agree with the statement. So I think that kind of approach is broadly in line with a more democratic or pragmatic way of understanding this. And at the ultimate day, it must be up to people, practitioners, other academics, to decide, is this helpful or not? Does it aid me in my thinking about these matters? And if you probably don't reach everybody, but if you kind of reach enough people, then finding this is relevant and important and helpful for them, then I think that we have done something that is reasonably good, at least. So, yeah.
Thank you. Can I follow up with a very practical question then, Brad, or are we constrained to one question?
Yes, please.
Okay. So the very practical question about offering a counter assumption to some prevailing assumption in the field, which is based on the experience with the review processes and top journals. So let's say when you, and I will be specific to the example because it's easier just to explain. So I have a paper which has institutional logics as the framework, and I use Friedland's, Rogers Friedland's perspective on institutional logics. And I explain it and I move on with like developing my own little contribution. But then the reviews which you get is that, why don't you have like Thornton, Acasio, and Lounsbury table there? Well, but because I'm questioning the very assumption, and because I'm following a very, like, it is not relevant because I speak against their very fundamental assumption. My assumption is different, but it's a very struggling review process. People don't like when you're questioning assumptions, and then they want to push you towards being more incremental. Like I feel like reviewers in different journals just push you to be more incremental and cite more of things which are already majority of the field. Well, how to deal with such review processes? Well,
I sometimes think that we just need to find a receptive audience. And people are very much into this, and I sometimes think it's an example of functional stupidity, where people have very much limited framework, and they have great difficulties in thinking outside this, and it's partly emotional and partly political, and also an identity issue. Then kind of interaction doesn't work particularly well. Of course, you do what you can in terms of being pedagogical and explaining this, and I do think that the Davis framework and also our stuff is a bit helpful here, because there's a clear methodology and our stuff here on assumption challenging, it's cited quite a lot and it's published in AMR. So I do think it should be a resource. But at the end of the day, this is tricky to do this in a convincing way. And the problem is always partly that one is not necessarily kind of sharp or convincing in one's own case. And the other is that in some cases, people are very difficult to convince because they have their blinders and so on. And sometimes there are political interest behind this. You don't want to change mindsets or get your babies then questioned. So generally, I think one should not struggle too much to try to convince a hostile audience, but then go somewhere else. And we don't have to publish in top journals necessarily. I think that some situations that's perhaps good if you like to have a job at an American top university. In other cases, I think that it's a bit overrated, at least on the European journal market. And some people do too much in order to accomplish this. And then they may end up with half misses. So they have very little then, despite the enormous amount of work. So I think that sometimes one should be a bit careful about this ambition, even though I understand the ambition definitely.
Well, thank you a lot for your responses and for the talk.
Good luck, Anastasia.
Thanks.
Thank you, Anastasia. Krishna, would you like to go next?
Yes, thank you. First of all, I wanted to say thank you for today's lecture. I'm here because of my professor, who is also joining in today. He happened to attend your lecture many years ago, and he was doing his PhD. And he was strongly recommending that in this talk. So I'm grateful that he recommended that. My question is, at least from the chat section today, I think it's a no-brainer that everybody is agreeing to the fact that there is a crisis of sort. And much of that crisis has been articulated today in your presentation. But I think one critical point is being overlooked. And that, I guess, is this strong push for finding statistically significant results and publishing what we call as positive studies. And there is very little room afforded for negative research or something which is like what we can call as failed research. And this whole fetish with finding statistically significant results and alpha values. I think, don't you think that is the real major reason why this incrementality of sort is happening in terms of mundane research, not adding any additional value?
Yeah, no, I think that there is rather odd, well, not odd, perhaps understandable, but there is this norm that you should have something positive to offer, a clear result, adding to something else. And I think that is tricky. I mean, in many cases, then the world is probably not as we like it to be. And also negative results, it's not like that. Or Foucault doesn't work here particularly well. Or that kind of theory or that idea, it doesn't fail. We don't have there is no institutional logic here. I think that could be a very interesting research result, for example, but people are a bit suspicious. It should be something positive. You should show something there. So I think that there is a tendency for positivity bias or contribution bias that is a bit problematic. I managed to publish one paper called Leadership, the Great Endurance Act, and it was that leadership doesn't exist, which is a bit hard for some people to take, but the idea was, at least in this particular context, when people claim to do leadership, if you look more carefully, it tends to kind of just disappear, fragment into pieces. Well, I'm doing leadership like this. Well, what do you actually do? Well, I sit in meetings and there's admin and it's budgeting and people moaning and groaning and so on. So what about this leadership then? Well, so, and that's an example of a more kind of negative or no finding, but I found it interesting, and it was published in leading journals. So sometimes you are a bit lucky.
Thank you. I can see Sam raise his hand or her hand. Would you like to ask a question, Sam?
Yeah, I think that's me, right? Oh, yeah, okay. Yeah, so I really appreciate your talk, Professor Alvesson. So I'm here in the United States, and I was thinking a lot about a person who I've looked up to as a very impactful researcher here. His name is Jay Forrester. I studied in system dynamics and sustainability topics, and he was very impactful. He did very good work. He built a community of people where some of those people went on to also have impactful work in their area, like Dana Meadows, and were able to coin some important terms and make some important contributions to the whole movement of sustainability. But for a long time, they haven't had the impact since then. Since like the early 80s, there hasn't really been new people that I think have had a public impact. And a lot of the people in our field have talked a lot about this, and they feel like it's because Mr. Forrester, Jay Forrester, he was so harsh. He was so good at tearing down everyone around him and showing all of their flaws. He wasn't really well accepted in academia because of that. And so it's a little bit, now there's more of a tendency, well, now we're a paradigm, we have a community, we need to keep our community alive and we need to keep our community healthy, but that doesn't necessarily, there isn't, if you try to stand up and say, well, our community is broken in this way, you're getting pushed out, So I guess that just my observation. I wanted to know if you had any comments about, can you be meaningful and have a strong community and build a community of people who are all being meaningful and challenging assumptions out there where everyone can participate and contribute? I don't know if that makes sense.
No, I think it's a good point. I mean, academia, we pretend it's also about intellectuality, about reasons, about evidence, good studies, theoretical contributions. It's only the quality of the work that we do that is significant. But of course, we are social tribes in academia. It's very much about sociopolitics. How we deal with fashions, relations, networks, how we avoid insulting people and then making their favorite concepts and ideas appear to be problematic. So we really need to think about this. We actually have a book on metaphors for the research process, and then we go through the various elements, and then we're thinking a lot about what's the nature of the academic community. Is it an academic jungle? Is it a marketplace? What is it? And it may vary quite a lot, but it's very important to think through what is the social context of our work? How are we handling this through networks, relations, struggles, politics, conflicts, etc. And in many cases, I do think that really interesting work means that you, in the short term, create conflicts within the community. In the long term, if you're successful, then you may be able then to stand out as a true original contributor to all this. But it's always some, and the more original you are, the more of ambiguity. So I think we need really to consider this carefully. And David's idea here about audience assumptions, I think that is very important, that we consider them, and then we say that this is how not only you, but we in this field think about issues. These are our assumptions. Perhaps some of these are problematic or at least constraining, and then we can come up with counter assumptions. And then it's not necessarily wrong or right, but we have a spectrum of different views here that we should seriously consider. Then you may be able then to work through the conflicts in such a way so that it's not too kind of painful or socially problematic, but it remains then debates on a more intellectual level. But it's very easy that the intellectual is translated into the social and vice versa, and that creates a lot of problems for our intellectual progress. So it's a good point, Sam. Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Varun, I can see you have a hand raised.
Thank you for this wonderful opportunity to be part of this unparalleled, I think, discussion. I've been to so many academic conversations on Zoom lately. This is unlike any other that I have been to. I went to the recent AOM 2020 virtual conference. I attended every single one within the organizations and natural environment and the social issues and management division. And this is stimulating, you know, really, really appreciate this opportunity. So thank you, Mats, and thank you, Brad. I'm a PhD student from Auckland, New Zealand, and I'm working on ecological sustainability. Sam, your you know, question just before me about this idea of trying to be meaningful and interesting to the point where I end up putting my community in the shadows of my work, you know, really resonates. And particularly because when I look at my field, you know, systems, dynamics, you know, sustainability and management, I do see that there has been, you know, a lot of work done in the 90s and you know, early kind of 2000s and right up to 2011. But when I try to problematize, you know, what's happened since then, I think a part of the problem, and, you know, this is, I guess you are my audience, a part of the problem seems to be that, you know, we have kind of lost our way in the sense of just trying to get published or trying to, you know, make a kind of a statement, as opposed to really solving the ecological crisis that business is obviously a part of. So you've got a lot of things that you've said about problematization in your various books and articles. And I'm actually right now in the second year of my PhD, and I've gone through so many different topics in trying to problematize this field in a way that is acceptable to my supervisors and to journal reviewers as well, because that is what my supervisors would like. So I would love to hear from you on how to problematize such a vast field where it's not necessarily so obvious what the underlying assumptions are, because ecological sustainability is quite, I guess, dependent on deep-seated values and things like this. So without bringing my own subjectivity bias into it, and I know people have talked about positivist bias, so without bringing my own kind of subjectivity and my own bias into this piece of writing, how to problematize in a way that I can actually, you know, get through to my supervisors and a few journal reviewers.
Well, I mean, in some cases, I mean, the other two issues that I mentioned before, that it may be a problem of being clear enough or knowing the literature well enough or finding the right kind of sample or domain to work in. So then we need this in such a way so it's more kind of manageable. Otherwise, you have so many different assumptions and messiness and ambiguities around all this, so that it becomes very difficult to have this like sharp going through of what are the dominant assumptions. So that could be one thing, and then the domain, finding the right domain, defining the audience, and the audience needs to be, I mean, it should not be the micro tribe only, but it should not be anybody interested in sustainability, but you need to find a topic and then a domain, an audience that you can somehow relate to. In some cases, there may be different audience or sub-audiences, so the construction of a suitable dialogue partner or punch bag or whatever, then it's very important, and it helps work quite a lot. In some areas you may have an exemplar, or you find some examples. So these are the most cited or most respected pieces in a particular area, now I target this, and then look around also for other works that are kind of representative and so on. But you look very carefully at one, I mean, example, that's Kuhn's definition of a paradigm, his three definitions, but one is the key writing. So Marx, the Capital, or some of Weber's texts, or of course, Discipline and Punish, or whatever. So you find this is the key writing, and then if you work with that, then the situation is a bit less messy, perhaps. Then there's always the problem of finding the right supervisors, or and educating your supervisors, so you kind of do the supervision in different ways. And in some cases, one is perhaps very much relying on the supervisor, the person with the supervision, that really can supervise you in your project. In other cases, then you are a bit more relaxed, and you see them more as kind of loose advice givers, or helping you with the political and practical process, or whatever. So one could work with the relation in different ways. And some countries, you can choose your own supervisor, you can have a third person on board, or I don't know, but you can perhaps manage the situation so it becomes as productive as possible. But it should not be a 4-year struggle with different wills and different ideas, and a lot of misunderstanding. That is quite terrible.
Thank you for that. Yes, love everything that you've said so far, and I will take your suggestions on board, and get through this mess.
Thanks very much. Good luck.
Thank you, Varun. I can appreciate this is 4 o'clock in the morning for you. Thanks for joining.
Gosh, we are deeply impressed. I'm always happy if you have a person in that situation not falling asleep and snoring during the presentation, although it's much easier than, of course, on Zoom to hide these inclinations.
Dennis, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, thanks, Ebrad. Hi, Mats. In your presentation, you spelled out a lot about the publishing norms that exist, which inhibit the development of innovative, critical, new ideas, such as this expectation that we should all be publishing in top-level US journals, which of course compels a certain style upon us as well, including this issue of gap spotting. But what I have often noticed is that older and younger researchers frequently respond to that type of thing by saying two things. They say, well, it's all right for you to criticize it because you're well established, but I'm not, and I have to conform to these norms in order to have some kind of academic career. And I know in the latter part of the book that you did with Yanni and Roland Paulson that you took that argument on full head. And I wondered if you could address it here, particularly because there are so many younger researchers listening to you who are going to have to make big decisions now about what type of career they want and what they're prepared to do and not do in order to achieve it.
Yeah, no, I mean, in general, I think it's good to publish journal articles. There's quality control. The journal edited by an historian that is very kind of open and broad in its scope. So large part of the journal industry is quite okay, and it's helpful, it's quality assurance, but then it tends often to be rather formulaic, and you have all this kind of distinct, tick all the boxes, don't deviate, do the gap spotting, the codification of the data, which I find is like making it's rather abstract and meaningless. You lose the sense of context and richness if you do too much of codification. So part of that is quite problematic. For academics, I think that you have to be, it could be a lecturer, an academic that is good at teaching, that read and talks with people, have intellectual interest, but we really need all people then to write a lot of research papers at every cost. Not necessarily. Of course, some institutions, they demand that, but I do think that a lot of places where you can be a good lecturer and respected for that. You may not have that much time for research, but so what? And I do think that that is the most important thing that most people do in academia. They teach. They learn young people to think and develop their skills and knowledge and so on. So I think that's one extreme. But then if you're very much into research, then of course you can think about issues like as prestige and competition and rewards and so on as one set of drivers. But on the other side, you have freedom, meaningful work, interesting stuff, maximizing your time and autonomy. And that may mean that you are not necessarily then that good at competing for a position at Harvard Business School or even Warwick in UK, because there will be a lot of people that really try to maximize the CV. You don't necessarily need to be part of that crowd, but doing something else and then finding outlets and areas which are more meaningful, and then also think about issues such as promotion. Is it that important to be promoted? For some people it is, but what's then the difference? It's status and so on, but perhaps one should consider doing a more risky, meaningful, long-term, engaging project that at least one has something to say. And then even if promotion or employability is slightly reduced, then I think it's probably worth it. So there are a lot of various issues around all this. And there's a lot of myths also in this area. You have to publish in a high-level journal in order to survive in this industry. But there are far more academic positions in business schools than there are space then for articles in A-level journals. So most people, they don't do that much of this A-level publishing, but when people do, it's much more visible, and it's a lot of myth creation around all this. And I do think it's very important that we think through this more critically and see what are the options, what are respectable, meaningful way to do research without necessarily going for this normalized or most visible kind of route to good academic life.
Mats, I can appreciate we are over time as planned, but would you be okay to take a couple of more questions? I can see a couple more hands raised.
Yeah, no, that's fine. I mean, people can end their participation, but there are still 110 participants here, so I guess the people are not all of that tired, even if you are up at 4 o'clock in the morning or something else that I find a bit dreadful. But anyway,
Okay,
no, but a couple of questions, and I answer quite quickly, briefly then. So yeah, fine.
Yeah, it's entirely up to you, Mats. If you're happy to take them, we'll.
I'm happy. I'm interested in this.
All right, sounds good then. I can see a third hand raised just now. All right, Noor, would you like to go next?
Yeah, thank you so much, Brad. And first of all, I'm extremely grateful that you considered me to be a part of this conversation. Mats, I'm actually so happy to be a part of this conversation. I'm in Pakistan right now, and I'm not sure what is your time zone, but it's almost 8 o'clock in Pakistan. So I had to rush from my office place to come and be a part of it. I don't know whether my question has a level of this audience, but I still have to ask that question. I consider myself an upstart researcher. I'm basically working as a bureaucracy in the Higher Education Commission of Pakistan. As one of my bosses used to say, that we are glorified clerks because we have a clerical mind and we write only official language. And when I joined DBA in Bath, it was very difficult for me to write one proper line in the research mode, the way an academic writing is done. But I've come a long way. I've been able to reach from that 0 point to a point where now I'm at the thesis stage. But having said all of that, you did mention about one category of people who do research or who are doing PhD for the sake of maybe a professional reason or something like that. Yes, I truly and openly admit I was one of them. But now when I look at it, the way things are going on, since I am sitting in the higher education realm, I feel I'm now involved, and I really want to do something. But let me come to my problem. My problem is very difficult to remain objective. And then there are so many regulations in research and academic research that, I mean, a person like me, if you will sit with me for 10 minutes, you'll be able to understand what my problem is, that I am unable to remain objective. I bring about my own subjectivity, my own emotions, tend to attach whatever the problem is. I mean, my supervisors are happy with my topic. I'm trying to work about on quality assurance, governance, and strategic management amalgamation to make universities do better. And they're happy with it. While I'm trying to do something, it becomes very difficult for me to remain objective. And then I keep bringing myself and then keep taking it out. And when I look at the work, I feel, oh my God, this is Noor. This is not how it should have been. So it's becoming very tough for me to go ahead. But at the same time, as I mentioned, I don't know whether I'm able to explain my problem. Too many regulations to keep me spontaneous, too many regulations, the things that we go on. So how can a problem like mine can take me ahead? Because I really want to be in the league, and not just do it for professional reasons, but really, really want to make a difference, because I feel my side of higher education needs something which I really want to do. So please help me, because I'm sure all my friends sitting here have really, really, maybe in their own way struggle and all, but I consider my struggle a little different from the rest. And I really want your help, because you've been inspiring. You have really, really given us a very good insight to it. But if you have understood my problem, please kindly help.
Yeah, no, DBA, you study your own context, and of course you are engaged and you are subjective, and most DBAs, they are a bit more experienced, so they have both advantages but also liabilities in terms of what they do and how the DBA can develop. I do think that one can use one's subjectivity much more. Of course, one needs to be careful and then being relatively precise in one's empirical impressions and statements. So there may be situations, episodes one could document. And then in order to make the empirical settings documented in such a way so they are credible and one's own blinders, they are not too obvious, then one can ask other people perhaps to comment what happened here and what's being left out and what's your view on all this. So, and there are, like Van Manen's talks about confessional tale, that you are there as a researcher and you describe it very much from your own clarified and explicit viewpoint. For example, when you do interviews, then you may just have extracts of the interviews that you present, but you can say that I came to this corporate building, I was sitting there, I was seeing people, the person at the desk kind of looked a bit skeptically to me, and you should describe a lot of the experiences, of the feelings and so on. And if that is done in a precise and credible way, then I think the subjectivity can be a resource. And Van Man's State of the Field, I think, can be a good text to consult. John Van Manen, Tales of the Field, University of Chicago Press. I don't know the year, but still. So sometimes one can work with subjectivity as well as a resource, because you have more engagement, you can see other things, you can allow yourself to not being so thin and so abstract as others, but use then experiences and observations. It's always a bit risky, so you need to have dialogue with supervisors and others, but this is also, I think, a good resource in many cases.
Thank you.
Thank you, Noor. Nasha, would you like to ask your question, please?
Thank you so much for such an engaging discussion, and it's really a problem that we're experiencing, and it's something that is not much discussed. And, it's really important that we discuss it. The way that I look at it is like, the exploration, exploitation, balanced within organizational learning theory. I just feel like research mostly has turned to be exploitative, and they just go and do research that has been done before. They find it's easier or less risky to be accepted, and that's unfortunate. I'm really interested, now currently I'm working on looking at the mining versus prospecting, and how does, being disruptive, or how can we be too disruptive, let's say, and still be accepted by the community and receive funding, or should we be disruptive but at the same time consolidative? So my question is, do you think that it would be best when we're trying to produce something that's interesting and something that is disruptive? Do you think that it would be better to put two perspectives, for instance, in a paper, just so that we don't, anger reviewers, and try to basically, take them by the hand and to show them that maybe it's the other perspective that or challenging, the core assumptions doesn't start from the beginning of the paper, but actually, we lead them to it. So I feel like if we just challenge the core assumptions in the beginning, immediately that paper will be blasted. But if we show those two perspectives, we kind of appreciate the other perspective and the core assumptions that everything has been built on. We're not really trying to anger anyone by it, but we just want to show the other perspective as well. I just feel like now, as an early career researcher, we have a liability of newness. We don't have the enough network. We don't have, the resources to go and publish in top journals. And something that I found is that even, sometimes you need to have someone that is more well-known than you are as the corresponding author, or maybe as the first author, because that paper won't get through, easier if you were the first author. So that's something that is really unfortunate, that, I see there's two problems. First of all, we're new early career researchers, and if we're trying to produce something that's interesting and something that is different, we might not be able to do so, unfortunately.
Yeah, no, the problem is that 90% of all submissions, they fail. So it's a very high failure rate to a lot of journals, and you say that is very unfair. Then, but I mean, there are too much published already. So the barriers perhaps should be even higher. I don't think that everybody's facing this problem. So my experience is not necessarily been much easier over time. The system is quite meritocratic. The exception is that if you have something that is really strong, or then sometimes people may be less suspicious of a more senior, well-known author than perhaps if you are a pure rookie. But on the whole, I do think that we should have some trust in meritocracy. So the good argument, the well-crafted paper, it takes a lot of weight. That means that also a young person, if you really feel that this is kind of good and high quality and so on, then you should not hesitate too much. And when it comes to acceptance then for journal publication, then one problem is that you are very, very provocative and very much outside of the mainstream. But I would say that a lot of people are too cautious, they're too careful, they don't have any out. It's like repetition or some mild critique of others. So that's another risk, and people often overplay. I think that the risk of not being very cautious or conventional, I do think that other risk is sometimes even greater, and a lot of journalists that like them something that stands out a bit more clearly as novel and provocative and interesting and so on. And then if you water that down too much, then you may have fewer enemies, but you have fewer friends as well.
Yeah.
So this is always a dilemma, and we need to.
It's a push and pull. Yeah.
Sorry.
it's a push and pull. I feel like you can't be too disruptive, but you have to be somehow disruptive, but at the same time, you know, accept the consolidative research. You have to, you know, show that it is worthwhile, but at the same time, well, that's the other perspective. That's what I've learned, you know, after my PhD. I've been working on my paper from my PhD for 2 years, going back and forth with my supervisors, finished my PhD, trying to publish my main paper from my PhD, but it's been so difficult because my work goes against most of the research that has been done around the construct that I was examining. And it's really sad to see that it just takes too long for interesting research to come out. So, you know, still struggling through, but hopefully, you know, there's a light at the end of the tunnel. So now I'm going in and working on mining versus prospecting and seeing, you know, what's like, you know, the Batmans versus the Supermans, you know, the Batman that wasn't, you know, didn't have the superpower, but he created something, was an innovator. Whereas the Superman that had that with him. So I feel like, you know, it's kind of like a battle, the Superman versus the Batman.
Sometimes if we find good metaphors or images, that can be an important part of this pedagogical process. So good metaphors or good figures tend to be helpful. Not necessarily Batman and Superman, but something else that makes it appear a bit more imaginative than the conventional stuff. We wrote a paper on the middle manager as a JoJo, going up and down, and I thought that new image. You're not necessarily middle managers, like stuck in the middle. You're going up and down all the time, and that makes the framing becomes rather different, and then the metaphor it's quite helpful here. Or elevator, you can also have elevator as an image of then the manager, middle manager. Okay.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, everyone, for asking questions. And Mats, thank you so much for your talk and answering the questions from the audience. In conclusion, Mats, do you have any parting words of advice, wisdom you would like to give to the PhD researchers and early career researchers?
I've given a lot of advice already. I would say that one advice one can give is never to listen to advice, which is slightly contradictory or ironic in my case. But be careful about supervisors also. So sometimes supervisors, they try to be helpful, but sometimes it's easy to be helpful to make people do exactly as you have been taught to do things. So in some cases we need also to thinking about that kind of relationship, and sometimes we can work with networks. So Sophie earlier asked about how to create networks, but sometimes you can work in a more supervisory way than is common, rather than having this kind of chain gang, highly dependent people that you encounter from other places than the supervisory relation.